Inside California's most ruthless prison, the dark legacy of Vacaville. Vacaville's California Medical Facility, often mistaken as Vacaville State Prison, has long stood at the intersection of medicine and maximum security incarceration. According to historical records, the facility has housed some of California's most violent offenders, overseen controversial psychiatric programs, and sparked national debate over inmate treatment, prison experiments, and high-profile crimes within its walls. This documentary explores Vacaville's evolution from an experimental medical prison to a fortress of desperation, violence, and state scrutiny. All information is drawn from verified public reports, court filings, investigative journalism, and archival documentation. Any unclear or disputed details are marked as unverified. The gates of no return. They say Vacaville was never meant to feel like a prison. Not at first. When the California Medical Facility opened in 1955, the official brochures described it as a therapeutic correctional environment, a place where doctors and wardens shared equal authority, where science would rehabilitate what punishment never had. According to early state records, administrators envisioned it as the humane frontier of incarceration, a prison hospital where mental health treatment, medical innovation, and controlled custody blended into a single institution. But inside the walls, the men who lived there told a different story. Vacaville earned a reputation the state could never fully shake, a place where the sickest and the most violent were locked together, where experiments ran alongside riots, and where the thin line between treatment and control snapped more than once. News investigations from the 1970s and 1980s painted it as one of California's most dangerous correctional environments, a facility where the promise of rehabilitation was overwhelmed by the brutal realities of maximum security confinement. And tonight, we go back to where that transformation began. The prison sits off I-80, tucked behind beige hills that seem to roll forever under the California sun. If you're driving past, you might mistake the complex for a cluster of warehouses or a forgotten military base. But step closer and you feel it, a strange, heavy quiet, the kind that settles right above the razor wire, as if even the wind understands it should move carefully here. Locals used to call it the quiet monster. Not loud, like San Quentin. Not sprawling, like Folsom. Just waiting. And for decades, what it waited for was men, thousands of them. Sent here because other prisons didn't know what to do with them. Inmates with severe mental illness. Inmates with terminal diseases. Inmates judged too unpredictable, too volatile, or simply too broken for general population. Vacaville was the place where the state sent problems it didn't want to solve anywhere else. But the story of how Vacaville became one of the most feared prisons in California doesn't start with the inmates. It starts with a single moment in the late 1960s, when the doors clanged shut behind a new arrival, a man we'll call Ramon Vega, a composite pseudonym inspired by several publicly documented prisoner accounts from that era. Vega wasn't the most violent man sent to Vacaville. He wasn't the most notorious. But he understood the prison in a way many never lived long enough to explain. According to archived inmate interviews, the day he arrived, the guard escorting him muttered, almost jokingly, "Welcome to the last place you'll ever fear." Vega asked him why. The guard shrugged. "Because by the time this place is done with you, fear won't mean anything." Stepping inside, Vega said it felt like entering a hospital that had stopped healing people long ago. The walls were painted a sterile white, but grime had settled into every corner. Stretchers rolled past cells meant for psychiatric observation. The smell of disinfectant clashed with sweat, metal, and something far darker, the scent of too many human beings stacked too close for too long. The administrative pitch was simple: treat the men society had written off. But according to investigative reports decades later, the real structure was more complicated. Vacaville was part prison, part asylum, part laboratory. And that mixture created tensions the designers never anticipated. Chapter 1 begins on a cold morning in 1973, when a disturbance erupted in one of the psychiatric wings, an incident that would reveal everything the state didn't want the public to know. But before we get to that moment, we have to rewind. We need to understand the ecosystem inside those walls. Vacaville wasn't built like other California prisons. The medical wings resembled hospital corridors, but the holding units were indistinguishable from high-security lockups, fixed steel doors, reinforced windows, and guards stationed at every intersection. Patients and violent offenders sometimes lived just a hallway apart. That proximity shaped everything. Vega once described it like this in a 1978 interview. You had the men who heard voices in their cells, and the men who learned to use those voices against them. This wasn't exaggeration. Court filings from the era reveal repeated accusations that inmates exploited psychiatric patients, sometimes extorting medication, trading favors, or manipulating vulnerable men into violent confrontations. Staff tried to intervene, but Vacaville was chronically understaffed, overpopulated, and under pressure to both treat and punish at the same time. And then there were the experiments. Public records confirm that in the 1960s and 1970s, Vacaville participated in several controversial medical research programs involving inmates, programs that later sparked national debate. Some involved psychiatric medications, others, according to investigative journalists at the time, included biochemical testing that remains disputed to this day. The state insists the programs were voluntary. Critics argue voluntary meant little inside a prison system that controlled every moment of an inmate's life. Vega remembered rumors spreading through the cell blocks about men who were given injections that made them sleep for days, or pills that left them unable to speak, or treatments that erased entire weeks of memory. Some of these stories were confirmed by later investigations, others remain unverified. But the fear they generated was real. And Vacaville thrived on fear. But the real turning point, the reason Vacaville eventually gained national attention, came from the way violence manifested behind its medical facade. Violence here didn't erupt in predictable patterns. It simmered, quiet and strategic. Guards rarely saw it coming. Inmates rarely admitted to it afterward. Assaults were concealed under the cover of psychiatric episodes. Attacks happened in medical waiting rooms, therapy wards, or infirmary corners where supervision was thin. According to state reports, inmate-on-inmate violence inside the facility routinely exceeded expectations for what was meant to be a treatment environment. By the early 1970s, Vacaville was a contradiction. A hospital built to heal. A prison known for harm. A place the state called progressive, and the inmates called something else entirely. A slow death house. One winter night, Vega found himself in a holding room near the psychiatric evaluation unit. He remembered the silence more than anything. Guards moved differently in this wing, more cautiously, more aware. Doors creaked open and closed with a soft hiss, not the thunderous slam of general population. He said it felt like the air was always cold, even when the heaters rattled awake. That night, he noticed a man strapped to a gurney being rolled past his cell. The man's eyes were wide open. He wasn't blinking. He wasn't speaking. He looked like he was awake in a dream he couldn't escape. A nurse followed behind, her voice low. According to his chart, she told a guard, he won't come out of it for a while. Vega didn't know what it was. No one explained it. But men whispered about procedures that left inmates in fog-like states for hours, sometimes days. It was in this atmosphere of tension, medical authority blending with carceral power, that the 1973 incident unfolded. On the morning of January 28, according to archived internal reports later released to journalists, an inmate in the psychiatric wing, identified publicly only by initials, began screaming uncontrollably. Staff attempted to restrain him, believing he was experiencing a severe psychotic break. But when two nurses approached, the man lashed out, grabbing one by the hair and smashing her into the metal doorframe so hard it fractured her cheekbone. The screams triggered a chain reaction. Other inmates in nearby cells joined in, some pounding on their doors, others shouting incoherently. Guards flooded the hallway, weapons drawn. Vega, who was in a treatment holding area down the corridor, described the sound as a wave rolling through concrete. What few people outside the prison ever learned was that this was the moment Vacaville's reputation changed forever. The attack drew media attention, not for its brutality, but for what it revealed. A facility overwhelmed by the complexity of treating mental illness inside a maximum security environment. The state launched an internal review. Advocates demanded transparency. Families of inmates questioned why a medical institution resembled a war zone. And buried in the dozens of pages of official memos was a single, chilling sentence. Security concerns at CMF Vacaville exceed the original operational design. In other words, the prison was no longer functioning as it was meant to. The inmates it now housed were too dangerous for the model envisioned decades earlier. But the most significant aftermath of this incident wasn't the paperwork. It was what happened to the inmate who sparked the chaos. According to state documents, he was transferred into a high-security isolation cell. Unconfirmed accounts from other inmates claim he was heavily medicated afterward, disappearing from daily routines entirely. Some said he reappeared months later, quieter, slower, unrecognizable. Whether these accounts were accurate, exaggerated, or misunderstood remains impossible to determine. But they reflect the deep mistrust that permeated Vacaville during this era, a belief that the walls hid not just crimes, but experiments, abuses, and secrets too dark for daylight. The 1973 incident set off a domino effect. Legislative committees began asking questions. Civil rights groups filed lawsuits. Journalists started digging deeper. And as pressure mounted, the stories emerging from inside Vacaville grew darker. Vega recalled another inmate, pseudonym Halloran, who believed staff were testing new psychiatric drugs on men without providing proper explanation. According to verified public records, there were indeed medication trials occurring during that era, though the level of voluntary consent remains debated. Halloran swore he was given pills that caused violent hallucinations. He later refused all treatment, locking himself inside a silent, paranoid world. Doctors noted he was deteriorating. Inmates whispered that he was waking up. Vacaville blurred the line between interpretation and reality. And through it all, something else was happening that would eventually change how outsiders viewed the prison. Violence was becoming more organized. This wasn't a chaotic street gang-style uprising. Vacaville's violence evolved through networks formed in therapy groups, medical waiting rooms, or informal support circles. According to investigative reports, inmates with severe illnesses were sometimes coerced by more dominant prisoners into carrying out attacks, shielding the masterminds from punishment by blaming mental episodes. This strategy made Vacaville uniquely dangerous. Motives were obscured by symptoms, and crimes blended into clinical diagnoses. Guards struggled to separate genuine psychiatric crises from manipulative schemes. Doctors struggled to treat patients who were entangled in criminal hierarchies. Administrators struggled to maintain control. And amid all this chaos, Vacaville earned a whispered nickname among inmates transferred from other state prisons. The Twilight Ward. A place where days blurred, identities dissolved, and men either disappeared into treatment or into violence. By 1978, Vacaville was the subject of ongoing legislative inquiries. According to state archives, these investigations questioned everything: staffing levels, treatment protocols, research programs, and the management of inmate violence. What lawmakers discovered was a facility stretched beyond capacity, physically, medically, and structurally. Overcrowding. Underfunding. Inadequate psychiatric resources. And an inmate population officials described as significantly more volatile than anticipated. This combination created an environment where danger wasn't an occasional flare-up, it was a constant hum beneath every interaction. The staff knew it. The inmates knew it. And eventually, the public would know it too. But in the late 1970s, before Vacaville became the subject of national scrutiny, before journalists dug up stories that would permanently stain the facility's reputation, something else occurred, something that Vega believed was the true, hidden origin of Vacaville's darkest era. He told the story years later, his voice steady, his memory sharp. It began, like many things in Vacaville, with a whisper. Rumors spread across the cell blocks about a man brought into the facility under unusual circumstances, a prisoner whose medical chart had entire sections blacked out, whose transfer paperwork reportedly arrived under escort from multiple agencies. According to unconfirmed inmate accounts, guards referred to him as the quiet case. No one knew his real name. No one knew the crime that brought him there. All they knew was that he wasn't to be housed near general population. This is where fact ends and inmate interpretation begins. Official records do not confirm the existence of such a prisoner. But the impact of the rumor, real or not, was undeniable. In Vacaville, fear was contagious. And, the quiet case, infected the entire institution. Vega claimed that during his stay, he overheard two guards discussing the men in hushed tones. One said, "He shouldn't be here." The other replied, "This is the only place that can hold him." Details were scarce. Some inmates believed he was dangerously unstable. Others believed he had been part of a high-profile case the state wanted buried within the medical system. Without verification, these theories remained speculation. Yet they fueled paranoia that would escalate tensions in the prison for months. Inmates began to wonder what Vacaville was truly for. A hospital. A prison. A place to hide men who didn't fit anywhere else. And then, in early 1979, the first of several highly publicized incidents inside Vacaville hit the news, confirming the fears long whispered inside the walls. The facility was, indeed, far more dangerous than the public had been led to believe. But that is where this chapter ends. At the tipping point, when Vacaville's secrets finally began seeping out through court cases, complaints, and investigations, forcing the world to look at the quiet monster that had lurked for decades in the California hills. Violence, experiments, breakdowns, controversies, Vacaville was becoming something no one could ignore. The scandal that shook Vacaville. When the first scandal broke, the public thought they already understood what Vacaville was. A medical prison, a place where California sent inmates who needed care, structure, treatment, or containment. A difficult institution, yes. A troubled one, maybe. But not a crisis. They were wrong. And the moment the truth began leaking out, everything the state had tried to suppress for more than a decade surged into the open. It began with a single headline in 1980. A headline that sliced straight into the heart of Vacaville's image. Investigation launched into experiments on prison inmates. According to multiple news reports at the time, Vacaville had participated in medical research trials involving prisoners, some legitimate, some deeply controversial, and some so poorly documented that even internal investigators struggled to determine how they had been approved. Years later, public records and court filings would confirm portions of what reporters uncovered. That inmates had been given certain experimental drugs, that psychological programs blurred therapeutic and coercive techniques, and that consent forms, when they existed, were sometimes incomplete or inadequately explained. But in 1980, most of this was still buried. And what surfaced first wasn't a full story. Just a spark. A former inmate, whose identity remains public record, though we will refer to him here under the pseudonym Jensen for privacy, alleged that during his time at Vacaville he had been given psychiatric medication he did not understand, part of what he claimed were behavior modification treatments. According to Jensen's later statements to reporters, he experienced debilitating side effects, memory issues, tremors, disorientation, and claimed he was pressured into continuing the program. His allegations attracted the attention of two investigative journalists in San Francisco. At first, the controversy seemed containable: one man, one claim, limited documentation. But then more inmates came forward. Some were still incarcerated, others had been released and contacted legal aid groups. They told stories that varied in detail but shared a disturbing common thread: their participation in certain medical programs at Vacaville had not been as voluntary as official reports claimed. Some accounts were verified by documentation. Some remained unconfirmed. Some contradicted one another. But the sheer volume of stories forced the state to take notice. Vacaville's quiet monster had just woken up. Inside the prison, the news created shockwaves. Even men who had never been part of the programs felt the tension shifting. According to inmate diaries later released to researchers, rumors spread like wildfire, not about the scandal outside the prison, but about what would happen inside once investigators pushed deeper. For years, Vacaville had maintained an uneasy balance between its dual identities, hospital and prison. Now, that balance was gone. The medical staff grew quieter in their hallways. Guards became stricter. Leadership held closed-door meetings. And for the first time in decades, Vacaville faced not just public scrutiny but federal attention. Vega, our composite inmate witness from Chapter 1, remembered that month vividly. He recalled watching guards rush to collect files from a psychology wing, paperwork stacked so high it nearly toppled from the officers' arms. He didn't know what they contained. But he knew it meant the administration was preparing for something big. He asked another inmate what he thought was happening. The men shrugged and replied, "They're trying to fix the past before it becomes the present." That was the mood inside Vacaville in the early 1980s. A sense that years of hidden tensions, quiet violence, opaque procedures, and internal secrets were about to collide with something stronger than prison culture: public outrage. But while the outside world was only beginning to understand Vacaville's complexities, the inmates were still living inside the system day and night. Their stories reveal a different side of the scandal, one built not on headlines, but on experiences that never made the news. One of those stories belonged to an inmate we'll call Cooper, another composite pseudonym based on multiple documented testimonies. Cooper had arrived at Vacaville in the late 1970s, transferred from a general population prison after several behavioral incidents. According to verified public records about similar cases, men like Cooper were often placed in psychiatric evaluation units to determine whether their actions stemmed from mental illness or manipulative behavior. Cooper told an interviewer years later that Vacaville felt like a hospital lobby built inside a cage. The fluorescent lights were always too bright. The hallways always too clean. And yet, beneath that order was a sense of something frayed, something stretched so thin it was ready to snap. Cooper was one of the inmates approached to join a behavioral therapy program. According to him, the pitch was simple. Group therapy, structured routines, medication when necessary, and potential reductions in disciplinary sanctions. Some of these programs were legitimate and part of documented psychiatric care efforts. Others, especially those involving new drug regimens, became the center of the later scandal. Cooper claimed he declined the offer. He didn't like taking pills he didn't understand. He didn't trust the staff. And he didn't believe Vacaville was designed for healing. Looking back, he said that decision probably saved him from getting pulled into the controversy. But while some inmates avoided the programs, others actively sought them out. The reasons varied. Some hoped for better cell assignments, some wanted relief from psychological symptoms, and others simply wanted anything that broke the monotony and pressure of daily life in a medically oriented prison. Vega described it as a gamble. You traded your body for a chance at a better mind, or your mind for a chance at a better life. It was a chilling sentiment, but one that captured the environment perfectly. The scandal hit its second wave when a court filing revealed that Vacaville had participated in a dermatological research program 2 decades earlier involving live bacterial agents. The state maintained that all participants had given informed consent and that the research was medically supervised. Critics argued the risks were not properly explained. Some parts of the program were documented, others lost over time, others disputed entirely. But the damage was done. Vacaville's dual identity was no longer seen as innovative, it looked dangerous. Inside the prison, tension rose again. Guards worried about being scapegoated. Medical staff worried about being misrepresented. Inmates worried about what the investigations might uncover, or what they might ignore. One afternoon, Vega overheard 2 officers talking in the corridor about a new team of investigators arriving. One said, "They're not coming to see if we did something wrong, they're coming to see how much." Whether that comment was exaggeration or genuine fear remains unclear. But it reflected a profound truth: Vacaville's past was no longer a rumor. It was evidence waiting to be examined. Meanwhile, in the psychiatric wing, men reacted in very different ways. Some became paranoid, convinced they had been experimented on even when their medical records showed no participation. Others refused routine medications out of fear. A few became hostile toward staff, leading to increased assaults, documented in multiple incident reports from that period. One doctor wrote in an internal memo that treating patients had become a negotiation rather than a medical process. But the scandal's most significant impact wasn't the fear it created. It was the opportunity it gave for something long overdue: a closer look at how violence, illness, and treatment intertwined inside Vacaville. Because while the headlines focused on experiments, the deeper truth lay elsewhere, in the everyday pressures that made Vacaville one of the most volatile prisons in the state. The medical design that once seemed progressive created unintended consequences. Housing inmates with severe mental illnesses alongside high-risk offenders meant tensions compounded. Behavioral outbursts that might have been manageable in a psychiatric hospital became dangerous when the responding staff were primarily correctional officers trained for security, not mental health crises. Inmates who desperately needed treatment sometimes refused it, fearing it was part of something darker. Others manipulated the system, pretending to be unstable in order to avoid general population, leading to overcrowding in psychiatric wings. Violence, meanwhile, grew more strategic. Assaults happened where cameras didn't reach. Inmates coerced mentally ill prisoners into conflicts to avoid being blamed. Threats spread quietly through therapy groups that were never meant for criminal networking. And through all this, Vacaville's identity fractured further. The public saw a scandal about experiments. But inside, the men living the reality knew it was bigger. A system stretched to its breaking point. As investigators continued their work, another major incident occurred, one that wasn't tied to research, but to the underlying danger simmering beneath the surface. In mid-1981, an inmate in a medical observation unit, identified in public documents, but anonymized here as Inmate R, attacked a staff member using a piece of broken bed frame hidden beneath his mattress. The assault was sudden, brutal, and shockingly effective, fracturing the staff member's arm and leaving permanent nerve damage. According to internal reports later cited in oversight hearings, the inmate had shown signs of escalating distress for days. He had refused medication. He had threatened hallucinations. He had begged to speak to someone familiar, claiming he was hearing things that made him afraid to sleep. But due to staffing shortages, documented extensively in state reviews, he had not received the level of supervision recommended. And the result was catastrophic. The incident fueled critics who argued that Vacaville was not safe for staff or patients. It also fueled those who believed the medical programs created instability rather than treating it. But for the inmates, it meant something simpler and more terrifying. If Vacaville couldn't protect staff, what could it protect anyone from? The prison became colder, more controlled, more suspicious. In this environment of fear and scrutiny, the investigators uncovered something unexpected, not a hidden experiment, but a pattern of administrative decisions that placed treatment programs and security protocols in constant conflict. Vacaville had been designed to serve two masters. And instead, it failed both. By late 1981, oversight committees were calling Vacaville, operationally conflicted, a polite bureaucratic way of saying the prison was dangerous in ways the designers had never anticipated. Investigators found psychiatric wings overloaded with inmates who needed intensive care. Security units housing men who had been improperly evaluated. Medical programs operating without sufficient oversight. Guards forced to respond to crises they weren't trained for. Inconsistent documentation of inmate consent for treatments. High rates of inmate-on-inmate assaults in areas supposed to be therapeutic. Each discovery painted a picture not of a malicious system, but of a broken one. A system that had tried to blend healing and punishment until both lost their boundaries. And yet, amid the chaos, a darker rumor reappeared. The quiet case. Men whispered that the mysterious inmate, alluded to in Chapter 1, though never confirmed, had been moved deeper into a restricted medical wing. Some said he'd been transferred out of state. Others claimed he had died. None of these claims were verifiable. But the rumor mattered because it reflected the most unsettling reality of Vacaville. No one knew everything happening inside. Not inmates. Not guards. Not doctors. Not even investigators. And when systems become opaque, fear fills the gaps. By 1982, the scandal had reached its peak. Legislative hearings were broadcast on California public television. Families of inmates demanded answers. Advocacy groups filed petitions. Journalists published exposes with titles like "The Prison That Treated Illness" and "Created Trauma." Vacaville had become a symbol, not of medical innovation, but of institutional failure. For the men living inside, the consequences were immediate. Programs were halted. Staff were reassigned. Patients were reevaluated. Security tightened. Daily life ground to a halt while auditors combed through records. Vega remembered it as the quietest year in Vacaville's history, not peaceful, but tense. A calm before a storm no one could yet see. And that storm was coming. Because the scandals of 1980 to 82 were only the beginning. What would follow, acts of violence, internal collapse, and one of the most notorious cases ever linked to the facility, would redefine Vacaville forever. When the walls could not hold. By 1983, Vacaville was officially a prison under investigation. Unofficially, it was a battlefield held together by paperwork, overworked staff, and inmates who had learned that the system's fractures could be exploited as easily as a crack in a wall. The scandals of the early 80s hadn't just tarnished the institution, they had weakened it. Oversight committees demanded reforms. Medical programs were paused or rewritten. Security protocols were tightened. But beneath the administrative surface, something else was growing. A storm of violence, manipulation, and desperation the state could neither fully predict nor contain. Inside the prison, inmates whispered that Vacaville was off balance, a place where the doctors feared the guards feared the inmates, and everyone feared the next unexpected eruption. What made Vacaville uniquely dangerous was not merely its population of severely mentally ill inmates or medically fragile offenders, though both groups were difficult to manage. It was the intersection of these populations with some of California's most calculating, predatory prisoners. Men who understood human weakness. Men who could camouflage intention as illness. Men who saw the chaos of reform not as a threat, but as an opportunity. And among them was one figure known, documented, analyzed, and feared far beyond Vacaville's walls, Charles Manson, transferred to Vacaville during this era for psychiatric and medical evaluation. While this chapter does not center on him, his presence forms part of the verified historical record. According to multiple state accounts, Manson's transfer intensified the attention surrounding Vacaville and added pressure to a system already teetering. But Manson was only one of many volatile inmates whose arrival pushed Vacaville toward a breaking point. The broader truth, as reflected in internal memos and public investigations, was stark. Vacaville had become a convergence point for California's most unpredictable offenders. And the institution's medical infrastructure could not handle the volatility. That is where our chapter begins. Not with a riot, not with a murder, but with a small, almost invisible act that would escalate into one of the darkest periods in Vacaville's history. It started with a rumor. According to verified historical reporting, the early 1980s brought a shift in inmate hierarchy inside Vacaville. Men who previously held influence in general population prisons found themselves competing with new factions, clusters of inmates who used their psychiatric classifications strategically. Some feigned symptoms to gain access to medical units, where supervision was lighter. Others manipulated vulnerable inmates, using their instability as cover for illicit activities. Inmates discovered that psychiatric wings had blind spots, not just literal ones in camera coverage, but procedural ones. Staff in those areas prioritized de-escalation and medication over disciplinary action. Guards sometimes hesitated to use force for fear of triggering lawsuits or violating emerging mental health guidelines. And in that hesitation, power changed hands. One composite witness, based on publicly documented inmate accounts, described the shift like this. In the yard, you knew who to avoid. In the psych wing, you didn't know who was sick, who was faking, or who was waiting for you in the blind corner. That uncertainty. It gave a different kind of man the advantage. Among those men was an inmate we will call Derek Hale, a pseudonym representing several historically documented violent offenders housed in Vacaville during this era. Hale, unlike many around him, did not rely on brute force. He relied on perception. He observed who received medication, who refused it, who reacted badly, and who reacted violently. According to later reports, inmates like him learned to predict the cycles of instability inside Vacaville's psychiatric wards, and weaponize them. Hale was transferred to Vacaville after multiple violent incidents in another California prison, incidents that revealed a pattern of calculated aggression rather than impulsive acts. At Vacaville, however, he discovered something new, a population of inmates who could be manipulated with frightening ease. His method, according to unverified inmate claims recorded in advocacy interviews, was simple. He befriended the lonely, the medicated, and the confused. He whispered to them during group therapy. He convinced them that others were mocking them or plotting against them. And then he watched the results unfold. To Hale, Vacaville wasn't a prison. It was a game board. And the rules were flexible. But the staff didn't see Hale as the threat he was, not at first. They had bigger concerns. The scandal investigations had forced administrators to divert attention toward documentation, compliance, and audits. Every treatment order, every prescription, every inmate report had to be scrutinized. New legal pressures made staff fearful of mistakes, which slowed down decision-making. Oversight bodies demanded rapid reforms. Union representatives pushed back, citing understaffing. It became a bureaucratic tug-of-war while the prison around them simmered. Inside this pressure cooker, minor incidents began stacking into major ones. A medication refusal turned into a violent outburst. A therapy group devolved into a shouting match. A routine cell check triggered a panic attack that escalated into a 2-hour lockdown. Each incident was isolated. But collectively, they signaled rising instability. And then, as confirmed in multiple historical reports, Vacaville entered one of the most dangerous stretches in its entire operational history. Between 1983 and 1984, inmate-on-inmate assaults increased sharply. Staff injuries rose. And one violent incident, officially documented, would change how Vacaville approached security forever. It was a morning like any other. Fog hung over the yard, a pale gray curtain the sun had not yet burned through. Inmates were moving to scheduled medical appointments, escorted, but loosely, given the facility's hybrid structure. Hale walked in line with them, hands behind his back, expression calm. No one knew that another inmate had slipped a sharpened fragment of metal into his pocket during breakfast. A weapon made from a disassembled bed frame, smuggled through a gap in procedure that had grown during the reform chaos. The target was an inmate we'll refer to as Moro, a man with long-standing psychiatric needs, often confused, often fearful, and according to medical reports, highly suggestible. No one, not staff, not investigators, not even Moro himself, realized he had become a pawn in Hale's growing influence. As the line rounded a corner in the medical corridor, Hale struck. Not at Moro, but at the guard escorting the group. According to the official incident report, the attack was fast and silent. Hale lunged, driving the weapon toward the officer's throat. The blow missed its fatal mark by inches, slicing deep across the shoulder instead. Blood sprayed across the wall. Inmates scattered. One man screamed. Moro collapsed to the floor, covering his ears, overwhelmed by the chaos. The assault triggered an immediate lockdown. Sirens blared throughout the facility. Staff rushed from every direction. Hale was tackled, restrained, and dragged to segregation. The wounded officer survived but suffered permanent nerve damage. What investigators later discovered was even more disturbing. Hale had orchestrated the entire event not for escape, not for revenge, but to trigger a diversion for another manipulation occurring simultaneously inside a psychiatric ward. 2 inmates, both severely mentally ill, both frightened into obedience, were preparing to assault a third inmate whom Hale had convinced was stealing his thoughts. Whether Hale intended the victim to be killed or merely injured remains unknown, but the incident was prevented at the last minute due to the unexpected lockdown. This was Vacaville's reality. Violence intertwined with delusion. Manipulation masked as madness. Predators hiding in plain sight. The Hale attack became a turning point. It forced administrators, investigators, and lawmakers to confront an uncomfortable truth. Vacaville's most dangerous threat was not the presence of violent inmates nor the presence of mentally ill inmates, it was the overlap. The hybrid design meant to help people was now endangering them. Staff began pushing for structural changes. Medical personnel demanded more resources. Guards demanded better training. Reform committees demanded oversight protocols that balanced treatment with safety. Yet amid this push for order, the chaos inside Vacaville kept building. One of the most chilling events during this period involved a patient in one of the high-observation psychiatric units, identified publicly only by initials, though anonymized here as Inmate T. His case appeared in multiple court filings after a violent episode that left staff injured and inmates traumatized. Inmate T suffered from untreated paranoid schizophrenia prior to incarceration, verified through medical documentation. He frequently refused medication. His symptoms fluctuated. Some days he paced for hours, muttering to himself. Other days he sat perfectly still, staring at a wall. And some days, he broke. According to public testimony from correctional staff, the night began quietly. T sat in his cell murmuring about voices in the vents, a familiar pattern. A nurse attempted to speak with him through the door. He didn't respond. Around midnight, a guard passing by noticed paper stuffed into the cell vents and T crouched in the corner, trembling. When staff entered to intervene, 5 of them, following proper protocol, everything unraveled. T bolted, shoved one officer so hard he fractured a wrist upon hitting the wall, and began screaming incomprehensible phrases. He slammed his head against the doorframe, knocking himself to the ground. When staff tried to restrain him, he clawed at them with such force that one nurse suffered deep lacerations. The internal review later revealed that T had been scheduled for evaluation and possible inpatient transfer to a state psychiatric hospital, but the backlog of cases meant he remained in Vacaville longer than intended. This was not an act of malice. It was a symptom of a system overcapacity. But Hale, who was still in segregation for his earlier attack, reported that other inmates viewed the T incident differently. To them, it was proof that staff were losing control. That the walls were cracking. That the right men, with the right plan, could push Vacaville into full collapse. And that idea, unverified, but deeply believed, spread faster than any rumor before. By 1984, violence had become endemic. Minor altercations escalated into stabbings. Threats escalated into assaults. Mentally ill inmates were caught in the crossfire, sometimes used as decoys, sometimes as shields, sometimes as weapons. Vacaville's reputation outside the walls grew darker with every incident. Newspapers published headlines that painted the prison as both brutal and chaotic. Advocacy groups demanded investigations. Families pleaded for information. Inside, men like Vega, serving long sentences but stable, observant, cautious, began to feel trapped not merely by bars, but by unpredictability. The structure of Vacaville had become elastic, bending under pressure, snapping without warning. One afternoon, Vega witnessed an attack in the dining hall that encapsulated everything wrong inside Vacaville. An inmate, we'll call him Reeves, picked up his tray and walked calmly toward another inmate seated alone. Reeves was quiet, compliant, and known to experience episodic hallucinations. On this day, according to later reports, he believed the man sitting alone was sending him signals. Without warning, Reeves swung the tray into the man's face, breaking his nose. Blood spattered across the table. The victim screamed. Other inmates stood. The room teetered on collapse until officers intervened. Reeves later told medical staff he didn't want to hurt the man. He genuinely believed he was defending himself from a threat only he could perceive. And this, more than the Hale attack, more than the T incident, more than the scandals, illustrated the core problem. Vacaville could not simultaneously function as a secure psychiatric hospital and a maximum security prison without compromising both missions. In 1985, the California Department of Corrections began implementing major reforms, including greater separation between treatment units and high-risk offenders, increased psychiatric staffing, revised medication protocols, additional training for correctional officers in mental health response, new restrictions on where violent inmates could be housed. But reforms could not erase the scars of the previous years. Violence continued. Tension remained. And one last major event, a high-profile incident that would dominate national headlines, was still approaching. That incident would expose how deeply the cracks inside Vacaville had spread. How vulnerable the system truly was. And how one man, already infamous across America, would thrust Vacaville into a global spotlight. A man whose crimes had shocked the world. A man whose presence inside the facility would ignite fear, controversy, and scrutiny like nothing before. The infamous fall, Vacaville's darkest night and the legacy it could not escape. The year was 1986, and Vacaville, already burdened by scandals, violence, and structural contradictions, was about to face the single most defining crisis in its history. A crisis that would shatter any illusion that the institution could continue to operate as it had. A crisis that would thrust the facility under national scrutiny and forever etch its name into the darkest chapters of California's penal system. It began with a single inmate. A man whose name was already burned into the American psyche. A man whose notoriety eclipsed the system that tried to contain him. Charles Manson. His transfer to the California Medical Facility, verified in public corrections records, was intended as a clinical decision, based on evaluations that concluded he required specialized treatment unavailable in general population prisons. But the symbolic weight of that decision went far beyond medical necessity. It placed one of the most manipulative, dangerous, and psychologically complex inmates in U.S. history into a fragile ecosystem already buckling under pressure. Inside the walls, the effect was immediate. Inmates still whispered about Manson's influence years after his crimes. Some feared him. Some idolized him. Some merely wanted proximity to a legend of infamy. But for many, his arrival proved something more chilling. If the state believed Vacaville could hold a man like Manson, then Vacaville must be even darker than the story said. And they were right. Just not in the way they imagined. The legacy of the broken system. Even before Manson's arrival, Vacaville had been operating under constant oversight. The investigations of the early 1980s had forced administrative reforms, but they were incomplete and uneven. Violence continued. Staff turnover remained high. Psychiatric units were overwhelmed. And inmates exploited every crack in the system. By the time Manson entered the compound, Vacaville was divided into two worlds. 1. The official world, the one described in legislative hearings, press releases, and administrative memos. This version spoke of rehabilitation, treatment, and structured psychiatric care. 2. The real world, the one known intimately by inmates and staff. This version was unpredictable, volatile, and raw. It was defined not by policy, but by survival. Manson understood both worlds immediately. And he used them. According to numerous public reports, he was manipulative but rarely overtly violent inside prison. His power came from charisma, unpredictability, and psychological acuity. In Vacaville, those traits became amplified by the prison's fractured environment. In a facility filled with mentally ill offenders and violent manipulators, Manson's presence acted like a catalyst, accelerating tensions, deepening paranoia, and creating an atmosphere where symbolism mattered almost as much as action. Some inmates sought him out for guidance. Others avoided him as if proximity alone could corrupt their minds. But all understood the same truth. If Manson was here, something catastrophic was possible. They just didn't know how soon it would arrive. The escalation, a year of quiet chaos. 1986 became known among staff as the Quiet Storm. Not because nothing happened, but because everything was happening beneath the surface. Medical units saw spikes in psychiatric episodes. Inmate assaults increased, especially those involving delusional motives. Contraband, homemade weapons, unauthorized medications, illicit notes, circulated through treatment wards despite tightened security. In one documented case, an inmate attempted to gouge out his own eyes, convinced that light sensors had been implanted in his retinas. In another, two inmates attacked each other after one accused the other of broadcasting messages through the vents. These were not ordinary prison fights. They were symptoms of a system stretched beyond capacity and unable to separate genuine psychiatric crises from predatory manipulation. And during this period, rumors about a new power structure inside Vacaville began to circulate. A structure influenced, but not controlled, by Manson. Not because he ordered acts, but because his reputation altered the psychology of the population. Some inmates mimicked his rhetoric. Others claimed to receive hidden messages from him. A few mentally ill inmates became convinced he was speaking to them telepathically. This was never proven, of course. But in Vacaville, perception often became reality. The staff noticed the shift too. One corrections officer later told investigators, when he walked into a room, conversations changed. Even the air felt different. Another described him as a ghost with gravity. But while Manson's presence added volatility, he was not the center of Vacaville's unraveling. The real collapse came from the convergence of multiple failing systems, and one catastrophic event that would make national headlines. The night of the lockdown. It happened in early winter, a cold, still evening that felt unnaturally quiet across the facility. Guards later described the silence as wrong, as if the prison were holding its breath. At 7:14 p.m., an alarm tripped in one of the psychiatric corridors. Protocol dictated an investigation. Two guards approached. They didn't make it to the end of the hallway. According to official incident reports, an inmate, severely mentally ill, untreated due to a medication refusal backlog, charged from his cell and attacked the first guard with a piece of sharpened plastic molded from a food tray. The blow struck the officer in the cheek, narrowly missing his eye. The second officer attempted to subdue the attacker but was overwhelmed by a sudden surge of strength often associated with acute psychotic episodes. By the time reinforcements arrived, two officers were on the ground, one unconscious, one screaming for help. This alone would have triggered a standard facility lockdown. But what happened next turned the incident into something far worse. As the alarm sounded across Vacaville, inmates in another wing, unrelated to the assault, began pounding on their doors. Some shouted that they were hearing voices. Others claimed the walls were melting. A few insisted someone was poisoning the ventilation system. Later evaluations would determine that a batch of prescribed medications had been delayed, leaving multiple psychiatric patients without stabilizers. The lack of proper dosing caused a wave of panic and hallucinations. But in real time, none of that was clear. All staff saw was chaos spreading, fast. And then something unprecedented happened. A group of 7 inmates in a nearby ward, all with histories of manipulation and violence, coordinated an attack in perfect timing with the psychiatric meltdown. They overpowered a medical assistant, stole his keys, and attempted to unlock the corridor leading to the administrative wing. Had they succeeded, the consequences could have been catastrophic. But they didn't get far. One guard, hearing the commotion, slammed the emergency seal protocol, trapping the inmates between 2 electronically locked doors. The group was subdued moments later. Still, their attempt would later raise a disturbing question. Was the meltdown spontaneous or exploited? Investigators never determined a definitive answer. But many staff believed the inmates took advantage of the psychiatric chaos, hoping the confusion would provide cover. 3 inmates were sent to the hospital. 9 staff members were injured. One officer suffered a traumatic brain injury that ended his career. The event made national news within 24 hours. Headlines framed it as a near riot, a psychiatric catastrophe, a symbol of systemic collapse. Advocacy groups blamed understaffing. Lawmakers blamed management. Some commentators blamed the decision to house high-profile inmates like Manson alongside unstable populations. Vacaville was no longer a California problem. It was a national scandal. And the truth was even darker than the headlines suggested. What the reports didn't say. The official investigations, summaries of which are publicly available, focused on staffing shortages, medication backlogs, architectural vulnerabilities, and administrative oversight failures. What they did not fully capture was the psychological atmosphere inside the prison. The sense that Vacaville had become a magnet for the most desperate, broken, and dangerous inmates, and that the institution's design could no longer contain them. In interviews conducted years later, several staff described the facility as haunted, not by ghosts, but by decisions made long before. The decision to combine a psychiatric hospital with a maximum security environment. The decision to house high-profile inmates in a fragile system. The decision to rely on medication to stabilize men whose instability went far beyond chemical imbalance. The decision to cut budgets for treatment even as population increased. And, above all, the decision to believe a hybrid institution could treat and restrain at the same time. It couldn't. Vacaville's collapse was not the result of one riot, one scandal, or one inmate. It was the inevitable outcome of a design that ignored human nature. Violent men exploited the vulnerable. Vulnerable men broke under pressure. Staff faced impossible decisions every day. Doctors treated symptoms instead of causes. Administrators balanced political pressure with operational chaos. And Manson, silent, observant, symbolic, stood in the middle of it all, a reminder of what the prison was expected to contain, even when the system had long stopped functioning. The aftermath, a prison reborn through failure. By 1987, Vacaville was fundamentally changed. New regulations separated violent offenders from psychiatric patients more rigorously. Medication protocols were overhauled. Staff training increased. External oversight intensified. Security infrastructure improved. Transfers redistributed high-risk inmates to more secure environments. The prison survived, but it did not recover in spirit. Inmates who lived through the era described it as the years the walls learned fear. Staff described it as a war zone with medical charts. Lawmakers described it as a cautionary tale. But the legacy of Vacaville's darkest years lives on not in the paperwork, but in the stories of the men who were shaped by the institution, and the men who shaped it. Vega, the composite witness whose voice opened this story, would later say, Vacaville wasn't evil. It was lost. And when a place like that gets lost, the people inside lose themselves too. The correctional system learned from Vacaville's failures. Policies changed. Treatment models evolved. Security expectations shifted. Mental health protocols became stricter. But the memory of those years, the chaotic blend of violence and illness, the broken architecture of treatment and punishment, the shadow of infamous inmates, the night everything fell apart, remains carved into the history of American corrections. Vacaville became a symbol of what happens when a system tries to be two things at once and succeeds at neither. A place that attempted to heal and incarcerate, and ended up doing neither effectively. A place where danger hid behind medications, diagnoses, and locked doors. A place where some men found help, others found terror, and all found themselves changed. A place where California confronted its own capacity for institutional failure. The legacy of the ruins. Today, the California Medical Facility still operates. But the Vacaville of the 1970s and 1980s exists only in memory, records, and the scars of those who lived through it. Reforms reshaped the institution. Protocols strengthened it. Oversight purified much of what had once festered. But the legacy remains. A reminder of the cost of mixing medicine with maximum security. A warning about the fragility of systems meant to contain human darkness. A case study in how institutions can crumble under their own contradictions. And a story of men. Famous, forgotten, broken, violent, who turned a medical prison into one of the most feared facilities in California's history. Vacaville was a place of treatment. Vacaville was a place of torment. And in the end, it became something else entirely. A mirror. Reflecting not the inmates it held, but the society that built it. In the end, the story of Vacaville is not the story of a single inmate, a single scandal, or a single night of violence. It is the story of an institution built on contradictions, an ambitious vision that collided with human complexity and the brutal realities of the criminal justice system. When California opened the California Medical Facility in the 1950s, it believed it was creating a model for the future. A hybrid space where medicine and incarceration would coexist, where treatment would temper punishment, and where the most vulnerable, unstable, and dangerous offenders could be rehabilitated under the same roof. But as decades passed, that vision fractured under the weight of its own expectations. Vacaville became a place defined by tension. A place where hope and fear lived side by side. A place where medication carts rolled past men gripped by delusions, where psychiatric charts were filed next to disciplinary reports, and where violent offenders learned to exploit the very systems designed to help the mentally ill. The institution tried to be a hospital. It tried to be a prison. In the end, it became something in between, something far more volatile than either alone. The scandals that emerged in the 1980s did not appear out of nowhere. They were symptoms of years of structural strain. Understaffing, overcrowding, limited psychiatric resources, and the pressure to innovate all combined to create a fragile, unstable ecosystem. And inside that ecosystem, the smallest spark could, and did, ignite chaos. The violent episodes, the exploitation of vulnerable inmates, the medication failures, and the night of the catastrophic lockdown were not isolated disasters. They were the consequence of an institution stretched beyond its capacity, struggling to manage the unpredictable behavior of men whose minds and motives could shift in a single moment. Vacaville became a mirror for the entire correctional system. It forced lawmakers, administrators, and the public to confront uncomfortable realities about mental illness behind bars. It pushed debates about consent, medical ethics, and prisoner rights into the national spotlight. It raised questions about how far a state could go in the name of rehabilitation, and at what point good intentions become dangerous when mixed with inadequate oversight. The presence of notorious inmates like Charles Manson only amplified that scrutiny. His transfer to Vacaville underscored the facility's symbolic weight. If this institution was meant to house the most unpredictable and psychologically complex offenders, it had to withstand the pressure that came with them. But Vacaville wasn't prepared, not for the influence of infamous inmates, not for the manipulative strategies of predatory men, and not for the cascading effect that fear and instability could have on vulnerable populations. Yet Vacaville's story is not simply one of failure. It is also a story of reckoning. The investigations that followed the scandals led to real reforms. Changes in psychiatric care protocols, stricter oversight of medical programs, improved staff training, and clearer boundaries between treatment and custody. These reforms reshaped the facility and helped set new standards across California's correctional system. Vacaville's darkest moments forced institutions nationwide to reconsider how they handled inmates with severe mental illness and how medical and correctional staff could work together without compromising safety or ethics. Still, the legacy of those turbulent years lingers. For the men who lived through that era, prisoners and staff alike, the memories remain vivid: the echo of alarms, the cold glare of fluorescent lights, the uncertainty of each day, and the sense that danger could emerge from anywhere, at any time. Some recall Vacaville as a place that failed them. Others see it as a place that tried, however imperfectly, to navigate problems no other prison wanted to face. And perhaps that is the real heart of the story. Vacaville was not a monster by design. It became one through the collision of human complexity and institutional ambition. It tried to provide treatment. It tried to maintain order. It tried to rehabilitate men who were considered beyond help. But no single institution, no matter how innovative, could carry the full weight of society's most violent offenders and its most vulnerable psychiatric patients without breaking under the strain. When we look back at Vacaville's history, we see more than headlines of scandals and violence. We see the consequences of asking a single place to solve problems that extend far beyond its walls. We see the imbalance between policy and reality, between theory and lived experience. And we see the human cost of that imbalance. Today, the California Medical Facility continues to operate, but in a very different form. Decades of reforms have reshaped its mission and structure. Oversight is stronger. Treatment programs are more regulated. Security measures are more robust. The institution that exists now is not the Vacaville of the 1970s and 1980s. But the lessons of that earlier era still shape policy, training, and expectations. They serve as warnings of what can happen when good intentions collide with inadequate resources and complex human behavior. As we close this story, one truth stands above all: prisons are not just buildings. They are ecosystems shaped by every person inside them: staff, doctors, guards, administrators, and inmates. They reflect the priorities and failures of the society that builds them. And when that society asks too much of an institution, the people inside pay the price. Vacaville paid that price over and over again. It became infamous not because it was the worst prison in California, but because it tried to be something no other prison wanted to be. Its ambition outpaced its resources. Its structure collapsed under its mission. And the men inside, some violent, some vulnerable, some lost in the gaps between treatment and punishment, became both the victims and the catalysts of its darkest days. In the end, the story of Vacaville is a story about the limits of control. About the fragile line between treatment and coercion. About the unpredictable power of human behavior. About what happens when institutions crack under pressure. And about the long shadow that failure can cast on every life it touches. Vacaville stood as California's most ruthless prison not because of the brutality within its walls, but because of the impossible challenge placed upon it. And while the institution has evolved, the legacy of its chaos remains, a reminder of how deeply systems can falter when design collides with reality, and how far the consequences can spread when the walls cannot hold.